Funding for Dos Bueno is provided by viewers like you. I have a Patreon linked in the description if you like what I do here. Releasing in 2014, Dark Souls 2 is an action RPG about the horrors of early onset Alzheimer's. It was the sequel to 2011's random smash hit Dark Souls, and immediately came under fire from fans for a wide variety of reasons. Some of these complaints are valid, but a lot of them are overstated, and the game is a perfect gateway into the From Software formula. Personally, Dark Souls 2 is my favorite game out of the Dark Souls trilogy, and that is a statement that gets less controversial by the year. The initial fan response to the game has had time to simmer down, and it is a lot easier to look at it on its own merits in the modern day. Dark Souls 2 had a troubled development, with the project leader being replaced midway through development, and the game undergoing significant changes in structure and genre more than once. Signs of this troubled development are everywhere throughout the game, with deeply strange connections between areas, weird boss and enemy placements, unfinished and janky animations, weirdly low detail textures and models in a lot of places for a game that came out in 2014, and the game generally feels like it's a bit raw in the middle and needs to go back into the oven for a while. Dark Souls 2 was also made by a different development team than literally every other From Software Soulsborne Elden Ring game, or whatever it is that we're calling this series now. This led to a different design philosophy in several places, which you can really feel comparing this to the other Souls games. Starting out with visuals, this game still looks pretty good. It is inconsistent, and it wasn't really state-of-the-art when it came out, but there's a lot to like here. Character models are particularly nice, and this was the first From Software game with real-time cloth physics on your armor. In fact, I think Dark Souls 2 is the first game that I ever saw real-time cloth physics in, though I'm sure it's not the first one that was ever made. The effects for the various spells and special weapon attacks are also usually pretty great, with a few looking janky or unfinished, but most do a pretty good job of selling that you have just committed some serious magic. The game also has some really nice lighting in places, but that lighting was a lot nicer looking in the pre-release footage. More than likely, the lighting got heavily toned down to make this game run on an Xbox 360, because Dark Souls 2 released right at the tail end of the 7th console generation, immediately before the 8th rolled out. The version I am playing for this video is Scholar of the First Sin, which is a 2015 re-release and remix of Dark Souls 2 with nicer visuals and a few alterations to progression and encounters. There isn't a huge difference between the two versions, but Scholar is the one I would recommend in the modern day, simply because it has a larger player base. Starting out in Dark Souls 2, you are treated to a really phenomenal intro cutscene, and then wander through some woods for a bit before a group of old women laugh at you, tell you you're going to die over and over again, and then let you create your character. You get to pick a class, starting gift, and create whatever beautiful abomination you feel like. The starting gift doesn't matter, and your class only affects what items and stats you start the game with. You're not locked into any build or playstyle from the start. The game also allows you to respec your character if you want to try something different, or if you need to change up your build to get past a tough section in the late game. Dark Souls 2 is a very free-form RPG when it comes to character progression and build variety, so there is no shame in changing gear in the middle of a playthrough because something just isn't working. After creating your character, Dark Souls 2 has an optional tutorial, and the controls for Dark Souls 2 are definitely different to most other RPGs. Dark Souls 2 is a strange hybrid between a fighting game and an action RPG. Each weapon has a moveset like a fighting game character, with a heavy attack, light attack, chains for either of those if you press the button multiple times, rolling attacks, running attacks, jumping attacks, guard breaks, parries, blocks, and generally just a lot of options at any given moment. You also have two hands, and unlike Dark Souls 1, your offhand isn't locked into being a shield and gets the full moveset of any weapon you put into it. On top of that, you can use any weapon in two hands, which unlocks another completely different moveset, and you can combine some weapons together in what the game hilariously refers to as a power stance, which unlocks even more moves. Some weapons can also cast spells, some can cast multiple types of spells, some have special effects or projectiles, some can make soup, and in general you have a lot of options. Safe to say, it can be pretty overwhelming at first, which is not helped by how massively terrible the controls are on PC. Dark Souls 2 is a game best played with a gamepad of some sort, because whoever set up the PC controls is an alien. You can toggle blocking with the M key, you have to double click to do heavy attacks, but if you want to do a light attack chain, you also have to double click, just slower. These are bad and best avoided, and it is very difficult to set up a set of keybinds for this game that will feel natural unless you have thumb buttons or one of those ridiculous MMO mice with the panel. Even on gamepad, the controls are odd, with attacks on the triggers and bumpers instead of the face buttons, which is normal for these sorts of console third-person action games. Or at least, it was normal when this game came out. Dark Souls as a series has pretty heavily influenced modern action games, and a lot of them have adapted this control scheme despite not adapting much else from the games, for reasons that confuse me. Once you climb the mountain, that is how weird the controls are in this game though, all of these options are awesome. You can really find a moveset, weapon, or playstyle that appeals to you personally. For me, I really like the basic mace in this game. Specifically the one-handed moveset. The mace has this wonderful looping moveset that flows really well and is decently fast. It has both single-target close quarters type attacks on its light attacks, and wide sweeping swings on its heavy attacks. This might be the best mace in video games, and trust me, I'm a connoisseur of maces. One thing to note about Dark Souls 2 that makes it more accessible compared to the other Dark Souls games is that it has a much slower pace of play. Compared to Dark Souls 1 or 3, enemies move much slower on average, as does the player. You have to be very deliberate with your movements, because it is easier to get locked into a slow animation or to swing in the wrong direction, because your character doesn't turn very quickly while attacking compared to something like Dark Souls 3. Everything being much slower reduces the reaction times that the game requires, and it means that the game has a more strategic and positional feel to its combat, with a lot of enemies having attacks you can bypass just by walking or running into the right position. I strongly prefer this pace of play because I like to play slow and strategic in most games. You have to think through your actions and plan things out, and greed punishes you way harder in Dark Souls 2 than in the other Dark Souls games. That said, sometimes Dark Souls 2 just punishes you for no goddamn reason. Dark Souls 2 has some upsetting hitboxes on attacks sometimes, being both weirdly precise and yet also just sometimes turning the enemy's entire body into a hitbox because fuck you. The problem is exacerbated though, because unlike the other Dark Souls games, you have a stat in Dark Souls 2, adaptability, that controls how good your dodge roll is. The higher your adaptability, the more frames of invulnerability you have during your dodge. Even with a good amount of this stat though, you will still sometimes just get scammed by the game and take a hit that very obviously should not have hit you. This is an issue, and it does detract a bit from the game, but these games are broadly built around learning the attack patterns of a given enemy and figuring out how to react to them. So once you find out which attacks on a given enemy have janky hitboxes, you can deal with it well enough. I am still running into new and exciting ways to get hit by something in Dark Souls 2 though, even hundreds of hours in. One way to reduce the amount of these that you need to learn though, is to fight at range using magic or bows. Bows are fun enough and much more viable here than in the other Dark Souls games, but magic's the good shit. I am a huge fan of magic in Dark Souls 2. Magic in the Souls games is strange. For the most part, these games are melee-focused, reaction-time heavy games where you avoid attacks by the skin of your teeth. Magic transforms them into games about spacing, maintaining distance, and managing limited resources. In Dark Souls 1 and 2, you don't have a traditional mana bar. Instead, each spell has a limited number of casts that you can use between each checkpoint, which the game calls a bonfire. More powerful spells generally have fewer uses per checkpoint, but are significantly more powerful. You are generally best taking a mixture of powerful spells for bosses and tough enemies, and a couple of cheap, general-purpose projectiles for trash mobs. It's a nice change of pace and a very valid playstyle, and it shifts the difficulty from reaction time towards managing distance, which is generally agreed to be easier by most people who have played these games. Magic in Dark Souls 2 comes in 4 flavors. The first is sorcery, which is the blue magic that is centered around inflicting a Toho boss fight on any random enemy and spamming high damage blue laser beams at people. It is based on how brainy your character is, and it doesn't have a ton of utility spells. Miracles are the god-fearing version of magic, being prayers that scale on your character's faith, and are mostly utility spells and healing magic with a few damaging projectiles and AoEs thrown in for spice. Pyromancies are the weirdo branch of magic, with low cast counts compared to other types, a monopoly on fire damage, and tons of weird utility spells like Get Really Sweaty or Iron Man the Hit Motion Picture. It doesn't have any stat requirements, but it does get a bit better with both your faith and your intelligence. Coming in last, we have my personal favorite, hexes. Hexes are a combination of miracles and sorceries, and have a ton of damage, along with a monopoly on the rarely resisted dark damage type. Hexes also have good utility spells, and the best spammable projectile in the game by far in the form of Dark Orb. Hexes also have a whole unique questline attached to them, and a few boss fights that are centered around hexes. They scale off of whichever stat is lower between faith and intelligence, so you need to spread your level up stat points pretty thin to play one effectively. It's a high risk and high reward type of magic, which is incredibly fun. Even with all of these options though, the game can be pretty difficult. If you end up having too much trouble with it, it also has multiplayer as an option, both competitive and cooperative. You can place a summoning sign down, which allows other players to summon you into their games to help them kill the boss of the area you're in. There is a weirdly complicated matchmaking system in place, but basically you'll get matched against other players with roughly the same amount of power as you. If you woke up and choose violence, there are also invasions. You can use an item called a cracked red eye orb to enter some random other person's game and try to hunt them down and kill them like a wild animal. This can happen to you at any point, though it is pretty rare nowadays due to the very low player count in this decade-old game. There are also NPC summons and NPC invasions in the game, so you're not completely missing out on this feature if you're playing alone or offline. NPC summons can make the game much easier, so if you're struggling with a boss or an area, there is no shame in using them. I use them quite a lot just to make some bosses less tedious, and it's a pretty fun part of the game. Structurally, Dark Souls 2 is a very open and interesting game. The story broadly doesn't matter and is more the domain of lore channels and brick staring, but the game has a huge running theme of memory and losing memories. Several connections between areas don't really make any sense. You can scratch the Earthen Peak elevator off your Dark Souls 2 retrospective bingo card, and it almost seems like your character just blacks out and wakes up somewhere else, or has just forgotten the journey from one location to another. Most NPCs are losing their memories and themselves, with Moglin the Armorer and potential trans icon Lucatiel being the most notable examples. This theme runs through the whole game, with a few late-game levels being set ambiguously in the memories of various dead characters. Exactly what any of the Souls games are about is purposefully vague and frequently debated, and unlike with Elder Scrolls, the Dark Souls brain rot hasn't set into me enough for me to start learning about the deepest Souls lore. You kill a bunch of sad old men and then sit on a chair, and it probably means something? Story is an unimportant aspect of a Souls game because it spends most of the game out of your way, just letting you play and go through these cool levels, and you can stop and start reading if you're interested in exactly why things are the way they are at any time. Getting away from the story, the actual way that you progress through Dark Souls 2 is very interesting. You start out with the goal to kill 4 specific bosses to open a door. There are smaller, less significant bosses on the way to each major boss, and the bosses are where most of the difficulty and most of the fun is found in this game. Levels and enemies are fun and can sometimes jam you up pretty hard, but the game's massive roster of boss fights is the main attraction. There are good bosses, bad bosses, easy bosses, hard bosses, weird bosses, and bosses that aren't really bosses. Dark Souls 2 mixes things up pretty regularly, with a lot of fights with more than one boss at a time, and a few fights that are more of a puzzle than a traditional boss fight. Each of the main four are very widely spread out and down their own chains of levels, and while there is an order that most people will end up doing on their first playthrough, the game is non-linear and you can change heavily the order in which you do these bosses. They are also, with one exception, around even with each other in terms of overall difficulty. This means that if you ever get stuck going towards one of the four bosses, you can go a different direction, get some more upgrades and level ups, and then come back to try again. This open philosophy towards progression would end up embraced very heavily by Elden Ring, which is a later game by the same developers. So I generally think that people have agreed that this is one of the better ways to structure this type of RPG. Dark Souls 2 has another little fun wrinkle though. Technically, all of these bosses are optional. If you simply get 1 million soul memory, which is the total amount of souls you have ever collected in your playthrough, you can simply open the door that they are blocking off. Souls are a resource you get for killing enemies, and serve a dual purpose as both experience points and currency in Dark Souls 2. You can either spend them to buy new gear and spells, upgrade your gear, buy consumables and buffing items, or to level up your stats and progress your character. Having a shared resource for both levels and gear is a great idea, as it means that you have to make choices every time you go back to town on what you want to spend them on. And it means you generally don't end up with your gear outpacing your level, or your level outpacing your gear. In addition, when you die, you leave all of your acquired souls on the ground and lose a little bit of max HP. You can run back to the souls to pick them up and save them, but if you die again before you get to them, you lose them forever. This seems like a pretty big punishment for death, but you can mitigate it with a ring you can buy from an early game NPC that removes the penalty at the cost of costing some of your currency to repair the ring, as it breaks whenever you die. This is a small price to pay though, as past the early game you will regularly die with well over 4 times the repair cost on you. The max HP loss can be cured with a consumable item called a human effigy, and it caps at a 50% health reduction. Human effigies are pretty cheap and available though, so I wouldn't stress too hard about it. Once you clear the first 4 major bosses, or get 1 million souls, you have access to the second half of the game. The second half has a straight line to the endgame, with a series of more linear levels that all build up to the final boss. This is also where you have the 3 DLCs open up. The DLCs are mandatory content if you want to get the true ending of the game, and are significantly harder than any of the main game content, but if you want, you can beat the main game except for the final boss, and then loop into the expansions to do them at the height of your character's power. The DLCs are well worth doing, filled with a ton of super rad items and weapons, and some of the game's most fun boss fights, but they are also full of some of the most concentrated bullshitium, and are very difficult to get through on your first playthrough. You can also choose to beat the game without doing the expansions and save them for New Game Plus. New Game Plus in Dark Souls 2 is actually one of its best features. The game changes significantly in New Game Plus, with all areas getting much more difficult, both by increasing the stats of enemies and by adding entire new enemies to the levels, with most of the most evil and obnoxious ambushes and encounters being saved for New Game Plus. New Game Plus also adds some new items and more powerful variations of existing items. One of the most cool parts though is that there is an item you can get in the main game that moves an area forwards into New Game Plus without you having to beat the whole game. This allows you to refight bosses that you found particularly easy to get extra souls for upgrades, or to pick up a second copy of your favorite weapon. I fought the Rotten several times during my playthrough for this video to get more resources, and having that as an option is really fun. Overall, Dark Souls 2 is a really fun action RPG with excellent replay value and a lot of variety. It has some flaws, mostly with janky hitboxes, broken animations, and a general feeling that a lot of things really needed a second pass. What is good here is really good though, and you can always find a fun playstyle or build that will fit you and get you through the game. It is not nearly as difficult or inaccessible as the other Souls games, and it makes a great first game in the series if you're considering trying it out, but have been intimidated by the reputation the games have built up as incredibly difficult mega hardcore gamer uber games. They're really not that bad, and no one is an elite mega gamer for beating them. The game has plenty of ways to reduce the difficulty through in-game items, and also a few ways to increase it if you're finding it too easy. It is one of my favorite RPGs by far, even if it is probably as actiony as an action RPG can get without turning into an Ubisoft game. You should go play it and populate the servers so I can do some more invasions. Have a nice night. Cheers.